Rain had started pelting the window panes when the doorbell rang. Margaret, wrapped in a cozy shawl, was halfway through her evening book when the sudden intrusion stole her attention. Setting her book aside, she sighed and made her way to the door. She found a young man, soaked to the bone. His eyes, although weary, carried an intense gleam of determination. Around his neck, a wooden cross dangled. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Elijah, and I am here on a mission of faith. Might I share the word of the Lord with you?" Margaret wasn't particularly interested. "I'm sorry, young man, but I'm quite content with my beliefs. Have a good evening." Elijah nodded, the rain dripping from his sodden hair. "Of course, ma'am. But even a moment of your time could mean eternity for your soul." Margaret rolled her eyes inwardly but didn't want to be rude. "I appreciate your dedication, especially in this weather, but I'd rather not." As she was about to close the door, the siren sounded. It was a haunting wail that echoed through the town, signaling an impending storm or worse. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Elijah, then back at the darkening sky. She sighed, feeling cornered by both the weather and the persistent young man. "You can't be out in this. Come in." Elijah's eyes brightened with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret led him down to the basement. It was a spacious area, cluttered with old furniture and stacks of books. A dim light shone from a single bulb, casting shadows on the walls. Once they were settled, Elijah looked at her earnestly. "I know you didn't invite me in to hear about the Lord, but might I ask why you've chosen to distance yourself from faith?" Margaret chuckled. "It's not that I've distanced myself. I just found my own way." "Everyone has their own journey, Elijah." The young missionary looked down, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "True, but our paths are illuminated by the Word of God." Margaret leaned back. "You're really not going to let up, are you?" He shrugged. "The storm gave me an opportunity. I'd be remiss not to take it." Outside, the storm raged on. The patter of rain against the house grew louder, mixed with the occasional clap of thunder. In the cocoon of the basement, Margaret felt a mix of annoyance and empathy. She saw in Elijah a younger version of herself, so sure of the world and her place in it. Deciding to indulge him, she asked, "Why did you choose this path, Elijah?" He hesitated, then began, "When I was younger, I was lost. I got into bad company, made poor choices. One night, a car crash took the life of my best friend, and I survived. It was a miracle, and I realized I was saved for a purpose. From that day, I dedicated my life to the service of God, hoping to save others." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "That's a heavy burden for someone so young." Elijah nodded. "Perhaps, but it's also a blessing. I've seen lives transformed by faith." They continued talking, with Elijah sharing stories of his mission trips and the people he'd met. Margaret listened, occasionally sharing tales of her own travels and experiences. The barriers between them began to melt, and their conversation flowed more easily. Hours seemed to pass, and as the storm subsided, Margaret realized she'd learned more about Elijah than she'd intended. And, in a way, he'd learned about her too, not as a potential convert, but as a fellow traveler on life's unpredictable journey. The siren ceased, and a quiet settled outside. It was safe to leave. Elijah stood up, hesitating for a moment. "Thank you, ma'am, for sheltering me and for the conversation." Margaret smiled. "It was my pleasure. Just remember, Elijah, not every soul needs saving in the way you think. Sometimes, they just need someone to listen." He nodded, taking the lesson to heart. "I'll remember that." As he stepped out into the now calm night, Margaret watched him go, feeling an unexpected sense of connection. The storm had brought an unexpected guest into her life, and though their paths were different, for a few hours, they'd walked together. She closed the door, returning to her book, but her thoughts lingered on the young missionary and the serendipity of storms.